right, so now it's time for our first panel, which is Dr. Jay McPherson, Dr. Sarah Higinbotham, and Anna Melton, one of our LES scholars, will introduce them.
There we go. All right, awesome. Hello, so this is our first panel, and it includes Dr. Sarah Higinbotham and Dr. Jay McPherson presenting the Whiteness of Service, Dismantling the Sense of Mission in Service Learning and Social Work. Dr. Higinbotham is an esteemed teacher, mentor, and founder and executive director of Common Good Atlanta. And Jay McPherson is a licensed clinical social worker with over 20 years of experience and an activist for the Anti-Genocide Project, 1 Million Bones, and an esteemed teacher as well. And their scholarships focus on human rights, working to lessen discrimination and strengthen awareness of how important equal access is in higher education. During the session, we'll be monitoring questions and we'll choose some to ask during the last 15 minutes of the session. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm Jay McPherson, and I'm here with my friend Sarah. And we spoke last week about how we thought we might begin this session. And you've just heard a bit of our official bio, but we thought we would reintroduce ourselves, foregrounding our whiteness. We are, as you can see on the screen, two middle-class, educated, fairly middle-aged women who are quite white. And we actually met on Screamer Mountain in Lillian Smith's summer camp. So we really wanted to talk about how the what she calls the psychosis of white supremacy shows up in our own lives and in our work. So I'm going to begin by introducing myself that way. I want to say that I really began to discover my whiteness in college. I spent a year in Brazil, and when I was finishing that, I thought I would go into the Peace Corps, and I told my Brazilian friends, oh, I'm going to go into the Peace Corps, and I thought they'd think that was so great, and they looked at me with utter disdain. They were like, oh, great, like, yeah, you really look like you can solve the world's problems. What do you bring to this party, and what, do you have no problems in the United States? And I felt a very distinctly kind of post-colonial shade of white at that moment, thinking, oh, right, we're just going to export me overseas. But I also thought the truth of their observation, which is that the problems of my own country are my own problems. So I came back and I became a social worker. And I thought, okay, well, I'll help. I want to help, which is something that will come up, I think, as Sarah and I speak today. But I became a social worker working for the state of Massachusetts, 23 years old with a clipboard. My job was to go into people's homes and investigate their pantries and their bedrooms and their parenting practices. And I thought, nobody like me ever showed up in my house growing up, right? My mother was not subject to this kind of poking and prodding and questioning. And I asked my supervisor about that, who said, oh, well, wealthy people, they get lawyers, this is something that, it's like people in poverty, they have to say yes, they have to let you in. And I thought, wow, that's so that this additional privilege of whiteness I hadn't seen. What part was the authority that, someone would kind of invest in me, this authority, but then the privilege of privacy, right? The privilege of being able to live life somewhat invisibly and outside kind of government interference or vision. So that's where I come at this. And Sarah, off to you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. So my teaching at Emory University focuses on 16th and 17th century poetry, drama, and prose. Surely one of the most white and almost solely male areas that Emory students will study. So artists like William Shakespeare and John Milton lived and wrote as privileged white men in a hierarchical, sexist, nearly monoracial culture. And it is that culture that has informed us for centuries that what Shakespeare wrote is actually canonical and academic. So that's my teaching sphere at Emory's Oxford College. But for the last 13 years, I've also taught inside prisons. And as we know, the American prison system is the legacy of slavery. It's the legacy of lynching, of Jim Crow segregation. The policies that overwhelmingly target Black people became the means to have an imprisonment loophole in the 13th Amendment. And we've understood this increasingly over the last 6 to 7 years as important people have done scholarship in this area. So that happened during Reconstruction. And then through subsequent history, mass incarceration has remained the legal and codified arm of institutionalized racism in America. Like Jim Crow laws, much of the incarceration system centers on a process of degrading human dignity and dehumanizing people whose primary crime often enough is being Black. And so then here I am as a white person who teaches primarily white literature, entering into that space. But I think that one of the ways to address that discrimination and that discrepancy is through what Brian Stevenson says about proximity. There is power in proximity. And I think that proximity is one of the most important ways to address the human rights violations like mass incarceration. So when teaching the humanities, either inside prison or outside, I find authors like Shakespeare asking us to consider, what does it mean to live in a community with other people, and what are my obligations? And I think for too long, what we've called service learning has become a way that white people can frame service, which is a form of white supremacy towards people who are not white. And that's what I would like to discuss today, what that has looked like for me for 13 years, and then some of the things that I have learned. Jane, your work.
Yeah, so as I say, I started in social work, as a very young person, and I stayed with it. And I was a social worker in service for 20 years before I went back to get my PhD. And around these issues, around the issues of human rights, I had seen in my practice what we call social work really going off the rails and being a form of oppression. And I thought, well, what would social work look like if it were a human rights practice? So that's what my kind of other academic piece looks like. But I also teach social work practice. And so what I'm doing at the University of Georgia, where I'm an assistant professor, is teaching those classes. And I love my job very much, but I also, as I'm, kind of building this service workforce, I want to create in them a kind of skepticism around themselves and around their desire to help and what that means. I realize I both learned and teach at a predominantly white institution. The University of Georgia didn't even allow Black students until 1961. And now about 8% of the students at the university are Black compared to, over 30% in the state of Georgia. We're still very much a predominantly white institution and a very white institution. We also currently, we have a new form of discrimination since 2011 where we don't allow students with DACA or undocumented students to enroll at the school. And Sarah has me investigating whether felons can enroll. I know they didn't used to be, but I have to get right up to date on that. But I think, it's like clearly, we have policies that do not benefit our students of color. So at UGA, my students are mostly white. They're mostly Christian, and they come to social work wanting to help. And I want them to, again, take that with some skepticism. We call ourselves a social justice profession. I'm very proud of that. That is why I continue to align myself with the profession. But it sounds great, but when you look at our history, you see that there's also a very strong lineage of social control and surveillance, as I was describing initially, and that punish poor people, poor women and families, especially in my own practice, for a social structure that was designed to exclude them. Right? There's a lot of concern about whether we're punishing people for their poverty or we're actually going to address poverty. The social work that I'm critical about really deals with large social problems as though they were caused by individuals. So today I'm going to talk about a social work history project. This is like a piece of my work that I'm excited about and is really just beginning. With help of librarians at UGA, I've been exploring the archive for images and stories of social reformers in Georgia and in Athens and at UGA that show both sides of social work, certainly not always the social justice profession. So now I'm going to attempt to share my screen. So let's see what happens with that. Share. Sorry about that. And here. Okay. Now I'm on it. So I wanted you to see this quote from Natasha Trethaway, who is a Lillian Smith Book Award winner. And this really stays with me. People always want to be on the right side of history. It's a lot easier to say what an atrocity that was than it is to say what an atrocity this is. What I'm hoping by complicating the past, even the recent past of social work, is to help my students begin to be able to look at where they are in placement, where they are going into work, and really looking at this practice. Is this ethical, what we're doing? Is this just? Am I promoting the values that I say I stand for? So, yeah. So this is the social work I was taught. These are the mothers of social work. Jane Addams and Mary Richmond. And, as you can understand how, looking at this, that I thought I would fit right in. It's remarkable to me how white our history is as it was taught to me, and I think it is normally taught. This is a picture by the Lewis Hine, who is an activist photographer in about 1910. This shows a social worker, a middle-class woman, of course, white woman, looking kind of fancy, well-dressed, something we might all like, helping an immigrant woman with what they call a defective child. But you can see the power dynamic very clearly in that photograph. There's no sort of democratic practice or sense of participation. The social worker is cast as expert, and she's largely an expert because of her class position. So now I'm trying to teach social work like this, to point out, some of the, plenty of the parents of the field were African American. Locally, that is Carrie Logan on the left, who was born into slavery, and the orphanage that she founded in Atlanta is still running as a children's home and providing services. Janie Porter Barrett in the middle was born in Athens, actually, and went on to begin settlement houses for African Americans in Virginia. It's another piece of the social work history that's often untold, is that African Americans were excluded from, for example, Hull House, Jane Addams' famous settlement house in Chicago. So a whole parallel set of services had to be set up. And the other place that I begin, so that's the part about just inclusion and showing, showing a separate history. But the other piece of my historical project is to show where there is injustice in social work. And in the School of Social Work where I teach, I can begin right under our feet. This is a painting from 1845 made of the School of Social Work, which is the brick building you see there with the smoke of industrial output happening. That is the former Athens factory. We used to be a cotton mill and a woolen mill. And the mill, of course, employed slave labor. This is at the very beginning of the mill in 1830. You can see this was in the local paper about how the hands employed, being small slaves, learn with so much readiness as to give their instructors little or no trouble, right? These very young enslaved people working in, where I now have my office and teach and would normally be, except for COVID, and I'm now in my living room instead. And then, but this is the note when the enslaved people were actually sold by the factory. The factory stopped having slaves in 1863, just before the end of the war. But you know, all along they had child laborers. This is another photograph by Lewis Hine from 1910 of young girls working. But in, you know, Georgia, we had some of the worst child labor laws, but of course, both slavery and child labor were considered ethical and just in their time. There was a huge effort in Georgia mounted to prevent child labor laws that were considered to be an imposition from the North and, you know, a crime against states' rights. By 1911, Georgia was the only state in the nation that allowed children under 12 to work in factories and that endorsed a 60-hour work week for children. But so that was an area of a lot of kind of reformers and social work energy in other parts of the country, but some of our local kind of women reformers who were the mothers of social work locally, they were working on other things. This is Millie Rutherford, who was one of the most important women in Georgia in the early 20th century. She's from Athens. She was a woman's educator, and she was the historian of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. She was very much opposed to women's suffrage. As you can see here, the Georgia Association opposed women's suffrage. They were opposed partly because white supremacy must be maintained. So all of this is interesting for students, or I hope it is, and kind of challenging as they think about, well, you know, how stable is this ground under my feet? How stable is it when I think of women reformers? Can I really feel comfortable about what they were fighting for? You know, how closely are my values allied to theirs? And then I hope they'll think, how closely will my grandchildren's values be allied to mine? I also want to have them understand the history of social work education in Georgia. This is the Atlanta School, which was the first school of social work in Georgia. It was founded by Black people for Black people. And is now Clark Atlanta University, the Whitney M. Young School, and they're 100 years old this year. But of course, or maybe not of course, but certainly in our society, there was a concern that we need a school of social work for white students in Georgia. So this report in 1947 and 48 was all about how it is that we're going to get a white school of social work in Georgia, and where will that be located? The answer, of course, was the University of Georgia, where I now teach. And this was our first graduating MSW class in 1966. And you can see that much whiteness was achieved. You know, soon after this, we did begin to having Black graduates and Black students as well. But as you can see, again, a predominantly white institution. And the final slide that I'll leave you with is just, this is a film clip. This is a still from a film clip that I really I want students to see. I think it's really important. It's a news piece about a spring break trip that was taken in 1968 by the white students from the University of Georgia social work to, you know, the slum areas of Atlanta where they worked with Black families. And they're interviewed by white TV reporters about what they're doing. And one of the big questions for these young white students is, you know, explain Black power to us, you know, as if. So anyway, certainly this is a project I'm currently working on. I will pass it back to Sarah. I hope that having some understanding of history and what's behind them will help my students maybe be better workers with Sarah in the prison system.
Thank you so much, Jane. And I want to reiterate again that Jane and I met at the Lillian Smith Center. We both happened to be there on retreat at the same time, writing and thinking and processing our work. So I was so thrilled to be able, and then it just started a friendship. So I'm just thrilled to be able to be here with you today, Jane. I've learned so much from you already. So since 2008, I have been teaching inside prison, and what started as just a sort of a loose alliance of people who wanted to make sure that people inside prison were having access to programming has grown into a nonprofit in Georgia. It's called Common Good Atlanta. And we have about 100 faculty from schools like UGA, Georgia State, Georgia Tech, Emory, Morehouse, Spelman, Kennesaw State, Agnes Scott, Clemson even. So we teach in 4 prisons around the state, 5 days a week. And these classes are accredited both by Georgia State University and also by Bard College in 3 of our prisons. And then we also have a downtown site at 101 Marietta Street in the center of Atlanta, where people who have been recently released from prison can continue college or bridge to college if they choose. And in that downtown class, we offer dinner every Tuesday night, MARTA cards, faculty, books. We pay the tuition to Bard. And we've created a space where people who are transitioning from prison back into the free world, although it's not free for them, have a place where they can be with other like-minded people and continue to develop a life of the mind. Because going to college on the outside, once you get out of prison, is incredibly difficult. So what I'd like to do is show a couple pictures of my students at Emory and previously at Georgia Tech, where I used to teach, going into the prison, and then what the inside of the prison looks like. Part, though, of the barrier to proximity with people who are incarcerated is that we really can't use pictures from inside the prison. And I think that has it has a whole history about how they are subject to a panoptic lens, much as Jane described, but how we are not allowed to see the real human side of people that we send to prison in large numbers. And then I would also like to share a little bit about what the ways in which I think it's essential that we prepare predominantly white people to go into what in the United States is a predominantly non-white space, and those are prisons. So to frame that, let's see. Can you see my screen, I hope? Okay, great. So here's a sample group of students on the bus heading up to a prison. This is a prison about 40 miles north of Atlanta, where we've been teaching for the last going on 13 years. And as you can see, this is a typical group of students coming to the prison, and they are predominantly white. And as I scroll down, you'll be able to see this is a space. And again, notice the faces are turned away. So this is the kind of picture that I'm allowed to share on the internet. Here is a picture of me teaching inside the prison to people who are incarcerated in the state of Georgia. And it is not unusual for me to be the only white person in that space. Here in this picture, I believe one white person is shown. So I'm going to come back to those pictures again in just a moment and also share with you some of the things that the students, both from Emory and from inside the prison, say about the proximity that's achieved when we have a college in prison program. So first, let me frame why the students are going in. One important element of my Emory teaching in courses like what I'm teaching last semester, Shakespeare and law, is to take my undergraduate students into the prison for combined classes. This kind of practice has come to be called service learning. And that means blending what students are learning inside the college classroom with some form of what we usually call community service. And I hope you'll hear the resonances of what Jane discussed as far as social work goes. Framing it as service, as community service, as service learning implicates us, I think, in a long history of white people creating a dominant narrative that our service inside places like prison or neighborhoods where social workers are going is to rehabilitate people. And that's the language that we use inside prison. And so I would like to back up and think about what that means in the context of a day like today, where we're untangling white people, untangling whiteness. That's white people rehabilitating people of color. We defend that perspective by saying that people in poverty or people in prison have made bad choices. And that's why they need white people to come in and show them what good choices look like. This narrative belies massive structural injustices, the injustices upon which mass incarceration and poverty in this country are built. So I think it's essential that before I enter a prison space, certainly before I take predominantly white undergraduate students into a white space, that we dismantle that narrative of service. That is a narrative that has reinforced white supremacy. The warehouse prison needs to be studied as a social problem that's the result of racial domination, not individual choices. Not choices that can be fixed by predominantly white college students or faculty who teach white authors like Shakespeare. I hope I'm framing in a way that makes you cringe a little bit, because it should make us feel that way. And so the most important thing to do in my teaching practice before the students come to the prison is to frame that history and allow the students to move away from the narrative that makes us feel good, and that is the narrative of rehabilitation. So when we often say, well, we've abandoned rehabilitation and we've moved to just punishment, we also, I think, must abandon rehabilitation as a way to frame this issue if we're actually going to go into the prison space and do some good and not just make ourselves feel good by that condescending attitude. So I'm sure it will become clear, and I'm sure all of the audience knows this already, that our country, and not just incarceration, was completely founded on white supremacy. And as I was thinking about today, as I often do for my classes when I'm preparing them to come to the prison, I reread an address to the Senate in 1900, not 1800, but 1900, where one of the state senators stands up to defend Manifest Destiny, America First. And this is his quote. "It is elemental." This is Manifest Destiny. "It is elemental. It is racial. God has been preparing the English-speaking people has not been preparing the English-speaking people for 1,000 years for nothing. No, he has made us the master organizer of the world." That's the structure, the political structure that created that space that you just looked into of the prison space with very, very few white people inside it. That was the attitude, and those are the laws that shaped that space. A law professor at Georgia State University, Natsu Saito, says that how this new government of the people reconciled its decimation of indigenous people, the appropriation of their lands, and the institution of chattel slavery with its foundational principles were by evoking those premises of civilization as a construct and racialized identities that excluded American Indians and Africans from the American polity. And so rather than opening up a space of discussion where my students can understand that, come in with their preconceived ideas that people go to prison because they messed up, it's essential that we frame the white supremacy that was at work, that created the kinds of laws, that 13th Amendment loophole, that we have been able to perpetuate this institution. So I think that Lillian Smith, before I turn to what my students say about these experiences, I think she frames it really well as a white woman herself, a woman who looks like Jane and me. She says, and this quote is written on the wall of her study at the Lillian Smith Center. She says, "To believe in something not yet proved and to underwrite it with our lives. That is the only way we can leave the future open." And so one thing that's important for me is for the students to be able to understand that when we're going into this space of the prison, we are going into something that has not yet been proved. And that is a form of equality, especially inside a place like prison. And then to underwrite that equality with their lives in order that the future can look differently. So I will tell you that if the people inside the prison continually ask for students to come in, when students come in with this mindset, they come in a way that there is no prison tour. We do not go look at a cell. We come in as students to sit down and interact with our intellectual peers. And those are students who happen to be inside the prison. And when we do that, then I would like to show you some of the ways that they reflected on what that experience is like. So I'm going to share my screen again. And these quotes and more are available on Common Good Atlanta's website and then also my own. Okay. So this is after a class that was held right before COVID shut the prisons down on March the 10th. The prisons in Georgia have been on quarantine since then, and we've been continuing to teach, but not with a physical presence. And so this is a class in which we studied Shakespeare's history play, Henry V. And here's a student from inside the prison, our professor and the Emory students with this approach. And I hope you can see that this approach means coming in as peers, not as people who are serving, are a real step toward revolutionizing education inside institutions, reducing recidivism, and educating people in a transformative way. And Akeem, who's now released and living inside Atlanta, says at the end, I encourage any students, professors, or advocates who missed this class to become a part of it. To anyone and everyone who has anything to do with it, thank you. Here is drawn inside. And notice that he says, to the enlightened minds. To the enlightened minds of Dr. Higinbotham's Emory class, thank you for not being swayed by the media that projects us as people to be feared. Thank you for being forthcoming and sincere in your perspectives about Henry V, about Shakespeare, about this really problematic leader, Henry V, English monarch. Every point of view you shared was a tool for all of us to open our minds to deeper aspects of leadership in community. It's time for your generation to take your place as leaders with a greater vision for communities, our cities, our states, and our country. And so this is someone who served more than 19 years, going on 20 years inside prison, speaking to 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds from Emory. To share three more from inside the prison, and then show you what some of the Emory students had to say. Sorry, that's an outside student. Here we go. I was nervous about the combined class. This is an incarcerated student at Burris Prison with the Emory students, but that changed in about 2 minutes after starting. Three things stand out: how our nervousness evaporated, debating the St. Crispin's Day speech, and our sorrow when the class was over. I was proud of the inside guy's ability to interact with the conversation, and I thoroughly enjoyed the day. And then one more, and that's here. This is Devarius. I never expected to take a Shakespeare class in prison. I expected to meet Emory students who were stuck up and thought they were better than others, but they walked in and my whole perception changed. I felt as if I were in a college classroom and not in prison. Before this class, I only knew to be or not to be, and I may never be an A student, that's not true, but I will try my best to keep up with the Emory students. I enjoyed how competitive your students were during the conversation, and for the first time, understood the Battle of Agincourt because of our discussion. And so what I'd like to emphasize there is primarily that the way they think about this experience, the people who are on the inside, the people who historically we would say were being served, was a focus on their intellectual growth because of a shared academic experience. They did not experience it as something where people came in and were condescending or showing up, as Jane said, with the clipboard to assess them. And I think Foucault has taught us just how pointless that was. So now a couple quotes from the students from, I guess I have time for 2 maybe, and then we'll switch to questions and answers here. My Emory students. Lin Wan says there was no precedence for what I could expect from a Shakespeare class in a men's prison, but in reflection, it was an experience that was refreshing and deeply contemplative. The general topic of discussion that night was community, a theme that seemed to sharpen the contrast between the 2 groups of students present in the room. However, once class was underway, I could see the men were equally, if not more, excited as any college student interested in Shakespeare. And then one more by Nathan. Let's see. I'll get to him here. Here we go. It's easy, Nathan writes. This is a white young man from Emory. It's easy to have biases about the environment inside a prison. Various kinds of media have demonized incarcerated people and have solidified an image in the collective mind that they are destructive rather than constructive. My experience at Burris shattered those biases. This experience really opened my eyes to how intense and expansive an education inside the prison system can be. And Nathan wrote more, and I would welcome you to explore what the students are saying on any of the media that Common Good Atlanta promotes. So I would love to hear questions, comments, critiques, suggestions about how to make this practice even less framed in white supremacy. I welcome that. I'm learning as I go.
Thank you, Dr. McPherson, Dr. Higinbotham. Do you have the website? I have it on the slides, but can you tell everybody the website real quick for Common Good Atlanta?
Sure, it's just commongoodAtlanta.com, all one word, Common Good Atlanta.
Thank you. And we do have a couple of questions, and you can add questions too. We'll go through, like I said, about 10:45. And the first question is, what do you ask students to read and how else to prepare to teach them and learn in prisons? And I would also ask that, I think, of Dr. McPherson too. What do you ask them to read, prepare them for their social work?
Mm-hmm. We read New Jim Crow. We just finished, in my class at Emory, we just finished the landmark Supreme Court case in 2011, Brown v. Plata, and looked at the racialized language in the dissents of the Supreme Court justices who voted against prison reform. We watched the film 13th. There are so many, Dr. Yancey has great work out there. There are so many great ways to frame incarceration as an issue of institutionalized racism rather than personal choice.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I mean, I think, I also have my students do exactly that. Certainly the new Jim Crow and 13th are on the reading list, but, there are, How to Be an Anti-Racist is a recent edition that my students are reading. And White Fragility, I think, is really important also for my students. Yeah. There's tons to read. There's really good scholarship, and there's more and more. Actually, I get my students, I mean, Matthew, you certainly are there. I get my students onto Twitter and have them look at the pushback. There's a lot of really interesting scholarship right now about abolishing foster care. And, as we think in the whole debate around whether abolishing the police and then maybe the possibility of putting social workers in instead, and how it is that we would, how we would achieve victory by bringing social workers together with police, with their two professions that both have these very complex histories and roots in white supremacy.
Yeah, I was saying, one of the books that I put in there, I'm actually reading right now, The Color of Law, which actually deals with, of course, housing. And if you look at all the legal language, a lot of these things, like Dr. Higinbotham just said, a lot of the legal language supports and undergirds a lot of the things that they're talking about and we're talking about today, especially in court cases. So another question is for Dr. Higinbotham too. And this has to do with COVID. And I think I know what your answer is going to be, but does increased capacity for remote teaching because of COVID provide an opportunity to provide greater educational opportunities in prison?
So Dr. Jamil Zainuddin and I just co-authored an article about what teaching in prison during COVID looks like, and you can find that this week in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. one of the problems is that unlike those of us at UGA and at Emory who have and right now who have access to telepresence, that's not available in the prisons. Primarily in most prisons, it's not, nor is email, nor are recorded video lectures that we can send in. And so the prison system has been working with us, and we have kept the program up. We continue to accredit at all 4 prisons, but it has not made it easier. It's made it more time consuming. But if anybody's interested, they are welcome to reach out to me. And if you can't find the article, I'll make sure and send it to you so you can get a glimpse of what teaching during COVID looks like.
If you want to do the link to it, I can send it out to all the panelists, or actually all the attendees, if you want to do that in a little bit.
Sure, I'll do that.
Another question kind of came up and said, where did the Natasha Trethaway quote come from, Dr. McPherson?
Oh, I don't know which work it is. I mean, she is I took it from the Lillian Smith Book Awards website. I apologize that I haven't read the book. I just found that really positive. And of course I should, you're telling me I should go read it, and I should. We'll find it for you in the course of the day.
Right. And there are a couple of more questions. I think Anna's going to read 1 or 2 of them real quick.
Yeah, all right. Someone asked how to welcome and have these conversations with students of color in your classes.
Thanks. Jane?
Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant question. In fact, 2 of my students were I'm teaching the capstone class for our MSWs for students who are about to graduate. And two of the women of color were just talking about their extra burden of work. And it's absolutely clear, and certainly faculty at my school, we discuss it all the time, the kind of added work that our students of color do as kind of co-teachers, having to absorb these lessons that are quite obvious for them, and yet is often new for the white students. So I guess my strategy with that is to really acknowledge that and to thank my students of color for doing that extra work that's often invisible. And it's a real challenge. I don't know, I'd be really curious what your thoughts of that are, Sarah.
I think it's important not to ask our students of color to represent in the classroom. It's too exhausting. And they are welcome and encouraged to join in this conversation of institutionalized white supremacy in the United States and how that's panned out in social work and in incarceration. But I also think that they need to be able to see white people doing that work, the work that we have to do. So it's white people who created this, and white people need to learn how to address it. So I try to be sensitive to just how both intellectually and emotionally exhausting it is to have to represent.
Mm-hmm. All right, and one more question. We have time for one more. Wondering if any students who have been incarcerated or have experience through family, for example, with the system, and how that might change the dynamic.
I'm sorry, Anna, I missed the last part. Students who have been incarcerated?
Or have experience through family, if there have ever been students like that, and how it changes the dynamic.
Yeah, certainly. And, I've taken students to the prison and not known they had family members. I don't ask them ahead of time, and afterwards they will talk about a cousin they have that has been in prison. I have a current student who grew up with her father in prison, and she's very close to him. And so to be able to see a lot of my formerly incarcerated students come to Emory and speak, and to be able to see people like that come and be given a voice and given a platform and be looked up to as an expert, she told me that has been enormously healing. I can understand it could be a little traumatizing too. And so what I try to do is just make sure that all students know I'm available to talk outside the kind of the group dynamics.
That's good.
Could I make a comment to Sarah? I'd love to, one of the things when you were, as you were reflecting on going back and forth across this boundary, I was remembering some research I did in Brazil 5 years ago where I was looking at rights-based practices and how, again, people were crossing these boundaries. And one of the boundaries that I saw crossed that we don't usually do in the United States is working at a domestic violence shelter, and survivors were actually taken by the shelter, which belonged to the city of Rio, in a bus and driven to the university where they were enrolled in classes around women's rights and were there with the students. And I had the opportunity to kind of get on the bus and ride with these women and, you know, see their experience. And these are women who didn't, most of them have high school, but were now enrolled on the basis of the expertise they'd gained from lived experience in a college class on women's rights and women's experience, which I thought you'd be interested in that.
I love that. I love it. And, you know, if you look at just the statistics, I know we're out of time, Matthew, but if you look at the statistics of incarceration in Georgia, the average education level is 8th grade. And yet, so what's crucial is for undergraduate students from our institutions to go in there and see that point at which they stopped, that was imposed on them, because these people are brilliant and insightful, and their work ethic would be the envy of any CEO. And so they out-prepare, you know, out-discuss the Emory students, and the Emory students love that. So.
One last thing, I know we got to go, but Dr. Higinbotham, I know we're going to talk later, but I had some Piedmont faculty actually ask how we can get involved with Common Good Atlanta. I know we've been talking about it a little bit, so we need to carry on that conversation. And if anybody else, of course, in Georgia, we do have people in Georgia who are attending this, want to get involved, just go to the website and reach out. Okay?
And Jane's involved too.
Yeah. And I mean, you have people at Auburn involved. I mean, if anybody's in Alabama, I know there's a project in Alabama too, out of Auburn.
Absolutely. So many great projects out there. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the chance to talk and chance to be with Jane.
Thank you.
And we'll be back at 11 o'clock.
Thanks, everybody.